so much for joining us tonight. So nice to see some familiar faces and a lot of new names too. So welcome officially to our second of two 2021 CFE ARLI Policy Forum events. I'm Sarah Hoppy Knight, the co-executive director of the Chicago Foundation for Education, CFE, and the manager of programs. And I am delighted to have all of you with us. So for those of you new to CFE, to our organization, we're a Chicago-based education nonprofit. We've been in existence for more than 35 years, supporting educators' needs and funding their self-designed projects and research, like you will hear about tonight. At CFE, we uplift and empower Chicago public educators in their work in an effort to support equitable and robust student experiences. We value the importance of self-examination and the power of self-reflection, and know how important both are when educating Chicago's diverse student population. So many thanks to all of you for joining us this evening. A few quick housekeeping items before we get started. So if you have questions during any of the 5 presentations you are watching tonight, you can post those questions to Kate Carter via the chat box. So her name in tonight's event is Q&A, is at the beginning of her name. So if you have any questions during the presentation you'd like to type out, you can post them to her directly. You also can ask questions during the Q&A portion of each presentation. So each presentation will be 20 minutes, thereabouts, and then we will have a 5 to 7 minute Q&A after each presentation. And so you can use the raise your hand function during that period if you'd rather speak your question. And then for each of the 5 fellows, we ask that you complete a feedback form. So for all of our fellows, this is likely their first time ever presenting this specific research and their findings, and it's very near and dear to them and their students, and any and all constructive feedback would be appreciated. So we will pop that feedback form link in the chat box as well at the end of each presentation. So tonight we are showcasing our final 5 Action Research Fellows from this past school year. We hope you enjoy their inspiring accounts of student research and discovery. Before we move into the presentations, however, I would like to quickly hand it off to Deb Moretsky, who has fearlessly and beautifully led this cohort during an incredibly unconventional and challenging school year. So thank you, Deb, and I will hand it off to you.
Thank you, Sarah. Welcome everybody to the second night of the ARLI presentations. I'm excited to see everybody tonight. We've got 5 presentations with 5 teachers who have worked incredibly hard this year. The process of ARLI is a rigorous one anyway. Teachers apply in the summertime, and when they are accepted, they then enter into a year where they're meeting this year fairly frequently because we did it by Zoom, working on their research, exploring research in the literature, trying things out in their classrooms, and pulling a paper together. So it's an awful lot of work and a lot of sun shining on me, I know. A lot of effort on their parts. I want to mention a couple of people. First, Sue Hansen. I took over this year as advisor to ARLI from Sue, who had done this for 17 years. And she left a program that is, I think, a remarkable program in wonderful shape. And I want to thank her again for the work she did all those years. And I also want to introduce you to Kate Carter, who was part of ARLI for, I believe it's 3 years previous to this year. And she stayed on this year to serve as a consultant to ARLI. And I am tremendously grateful that she was there for me and answered all my questions and was extremely patient, and also helped all of the fellows throughout the entire year. And Kate, you want to say a couple words before we move on?
I just want to say that I'm really happy to get to be part of this for my 4th year. It's always really inspiring to see everyone's projects, and I can't imagine doing it in a remote setting. So props to the 5 people, as well as the 4 fantastic presentations from last week. Thank you, Deb.
So I get to introduce our first presenter, and tonight Estela Mira Barada, and I didn't say that as beautifully as she does, was our teacher who taught the youngest students among all the teachers in our cohort. She had preschool kids, and she's a bilingual teacher, and what she wanted to take a look at was how she could get English-speaking students more excited about speaking Spanish as a second language. I think she learned a lot this year, not only about ways that she could try to accomplish exactly that, but about things that she did that served her practice well, and also about navigating, as Kate said, through an incredibly challenging time. She was one of the first teachers who were called back to school when CPS started reopening school in stages, and it was a real challenge for her to deal with that. So she's done a terrific job, and I'm looking forward to what she has to share with us tonight about her work with 3- and 4-year-olds.
Thank you, Deb, for that introduction. Wonderful. Thank you, Sarah and Kate. So let me share my screen. Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight. Let me share. And I think here. Okay. So let me just here. Good evening, everyone. My name is Estela Mira Barreda. I'm a pre-K teacher at Whittier Dual Language Magnet School. The title of my presentation is No More Buenos Dias, Teaching and Learning Remotely in a Dual Language Preschool. I'll first describe the context and rationale for my research, then I'll explain my research project, my findings, and I'll finish with some policy recommendations. I conducted my research with my preschool students. We are a dual language program in Pilsen, so my students are supposed to receive 80% of instruction time in Espanol and 20% in English. This year, because of the pandemic, we met remotely via Google Meet for 1 hour a day. You can see my classroom. Given my teaching context, I wanted to know what happens to my English dominant students' language use and my own language use as I regularly front load vocabulary with total physical response, or TPR, and implement translanguaging in my instruction. To answer my question, I looked at my English dominant students' Spanish during teacher-led activities, during student-led activities. Then I reflected on my own teaching strategies with all of my students. And finally, I looked at English dominant students' attitudes towards Spanish. I started the year with 10 students. 5 are English dominant students. 3 of them are Spanish dominant students, and 2 of them are balanced bilingual. To answer aspects of my question regarding English dominant students, I looked at data from 4 students, my case studies. I focus on English dominant students because in a regular in-person day, my students spend more than half the day in student-led activities. So I want to make sure my English dominant students feel comfortable interacting in Spanish as early as possible, so that student-led time doesn't turn into English time. This year, my students saw me for 1 hour a day. This was their first experience with school. It was all remote. They never met me in person, and I'm speaking Spanish, which for many of them is their only exposure to the language. I wanted to make sure my students felt welcome, safe, and confident, which was especially challenging this year. So that's why I chose to implement total physical response and translanguaging as my strategies to support their Spanish language. The version of total physical response that I implemented is to coordinate oral language with physical movement. I introduced new vocabulary with TPR at least once a week. This method reduces anxiety in students, and students are more willing to speak in the target language. The thing that I noticed with my students is that it provides a very easy way for my students to participate and to feel successful. This is a little clip of me doing TPR. So again, these gestures are planned for, they are in my lesson plan, and I'm teaching these gestures and these words to my students.
Pájaro. Entonces vamos todos a poner el pico así y vamos a decir pájaro. ¿Cómo se siente esta niña? Asustada. Muy bien, Dalila. Ajá, ¿y cómo se decía en español? ¿Te acuerdas? ¿Así? ¿Alguien se acuerda?
So I also implemented translanguaging, and Ofelia Garcia defines translanguaging as a dynamic process in which multilingual speakers navigate complex social and cognitive demands through strategic employment of multiple languages. In education, translanguaging can be controlled by the student and the teacher. An idea that stood out when I was doing my literature review, was children's opportunities for development of multilingualism increase when they receive native language support. And so I decided to interpret and implement translanguaging. And the way that we did it is that I stayed in Spanish as much as possible to provide a consistent model for Spanish discourse for my students. And I asked my co-teacher, Ms. Solis, to stay in Spanish as well. However, when we had a situation where a student didn't understand before that frustration level happened, my co-teacher would offer support in English. And that provided a small scaffold for the student to participate and to feel successful. This is a little video of me and her doing this translanguaging.
Ayole, puedes hacer movimiento así con tu brazo, árbol. Can you move your arms like a tree? Árbol. ¿Te acuerdas, Jaylani, cómo se llamaba esto? ¿Qué es esto, Jaylani? ¿Puedes apretar tu micrófono?
What is that, Jaylani?
¿Quién vino encima de tu abuela? ¿El niño o el perro? ¿Quién vino encima?
This word. Who slept on top of the grandma? Hey.
The kid. El niño. Muy bien, Violet. Very nice.
So I collected data by recording the lessons via Google Meet. I interviewed the parents of 3 focus students, and I interviewed my co-teacher. And I also used my teacher journal, where I noted reflections bi-weekly. Because of a regular in-person day in pre-K is so heavy in student-led activities, I wanted to make sure I provided opportunities for that kind of time, even during our 1-hour remote learning. So I collected data during both teacher-led and student-led. The videos I recorded during teacher-led activities for this research were mostly conversations during read-alouds or activities that followed after a read-aloud. The videos recorded during student-led activities were more varied. The purpose of these activities was to encourage student-to-student discussion. We had collaborative coloring activities where students had to plan in advance which parts of the drawing each one of them was going to color. We had collaborative story writing where I provided the sentence stems and they had to collaborate to write the story. And we also had show and tell experiences where we all got to virtually dress our best and present our topic in our fancy theater. You can see we have a Spider-Man fan in the classroom. This is some of the data I saw from November and December for speaking during teacher-led activities and student-led activities. The segments I looked at were between 15 and 20 minutes long, and you can see there is a lot of green, that's English, much more English during the student-led activities than during teacher-led activities. The fact that we would regularly implement TPR before the read-alouds, making those words fresher in their mind to use, offers a possible explanation for the difference. You can also see a little bit of increase of Spanish from in each one of the contexts from November to December. While they were not speaking much Spanish yet, I wanted to see how much they understood. So as Roberts theorizes, speaking emerges as the learner gains competence. So from this view, speaking is not a means of language learning. Rather, it is an expression of language learned. So to see how much they understood, I looked at the questions I asked in Spanish. The blue is the percentage of questions I asked in Spanish and my students understood. And the green is the percentage of questions that needed further support. I quickly realized that in November, they were already understanding more than half of my questions in both contexts. And you can see a little bit of increase of questions understood from November to December. In December, we went on winter break, and when we returned, we taught remotely for a week. Due to an impasse with CTU CPS, I wasn't able to teach my students for 2 weeks. Because I could not collect data on my students during that time, I started thinking and reflecting about what I had noticed about myself and my own language use as I was becoming more aware of their language development. And that reflective time led me to ask, what strategies do I use as I become more aware of my students' language skills? And for this analysis, I looked at my entire class, all of my students. By then I had 8 students. 2 of my focus students had moved out of the district. I looked at 5-minute segments of videos across the groups because I wanted to see if I was using this support differently with each group. The first thing I looked at was unplanned gestures. This is not TPR. I didn't plan for these movements or gestures. I didn't teach these gestures to my students. They just happened spontaneously. And here's a video of me doing these gestures.
Yo veo 2 gatos. Oh, un globo. Globos. Todas las letras tienen una mamá, una grande o mayúscula, y tienen una letra chiquitita o minúscula. Entonces, osos se despiertan, están oliendo. Están oliendo. Yo veo.
Again, these gestures were not planned for. The other strategy I noticed was that I was using picture support. I would either show them pictures or images that I had printed out or zoom in on specific aspects of pictures on the book I was reading. And you'll see a little bit of me doing that.
Me gustó mucho cómo escucharon mientras leíamos el libro. Muy bien, Loren, ¿cómo se siente Harry? Happy. ¿Y en español? Feliz. Feliz. Él se siente. Y mira cómo se siente la serpiente. Está triste.
This graph shows all my students. In blue is the group of students. These were small groups. And the blue is the small group with only Spanish dominant students. The red is the small group with only English dominant students. And the orange has a mixed group. These were, I looked at 5-minute segments in November, February, and March. In examining my data, I noticed that I consistently use more gestures and picture supports in the red and orange groups, which are where the English dominant students are. And it makes sense since those students need more support, but I find it really fascinating that this happened without planning. I just by being in sync with the needs of my students, noticing when they needed extra support as I was becoming more aware of their language development. So finally, as a dual language teacher, I want my students to learn Spanish. But what's more important to me is that they develop an awareness that they are learning another language and that they are emerging bilinguals. So I want them to feel proud of becoming bilingual, or sorry, of that bilingual identity. So I tracked their attitudes towards learning Spanish to see if there was any changes. For this, I interviewed their parents because I figure asking the students would likely lead to answers they thought I wanted to hear. Interviewing their parents can also be problematic, but I was interested in hearing about what they share at home about Spanish. So this is Dalila. I didn't see a big change in how her mom talked about her engagement with Spanish. This is the question I asked her. Her mom, how do you think your child feels about learning Spanish? And what makes you think that? In October, she said, I think she wants to learn. Then in February, she indicated that she likes to speak Spanish. And she also said, sometimes she says things in Spanish and thinks she said them in English, which is a clear example for me that she's acquiring the language and using it spontaneously. And by June, the mom responded that she likes Spanish and that sometimes she'll ask how to say things in Spanish. So you can see a little bit more engagement, more motivation. Lorenzo, I think his attitude improved the most. In October, mom mentioned words like fear, challenge, work. By February, when asked the same question, she said more interest, doesn't get frustrated. He sees it more like a game, wants to learn. He's more positive, curious. By June, she said he was feeling much more positive towards Spanish, excited to attend school every day. He makes movements with his words when he's singing. So positive improvement. And Adrian was one of the students that moved away in January. And he's the reason for the title, No More Buenos Dias. In October, his mom said that he was very resistant to talk Spanish with her. But with other people in daycare, he was better. I have a video of Adrian from December, so you can see what he had to say about this.
How does that feel, learning 2 languages? Do you like it or you don't like it? Who wants to share? Adrian, how do you feel learning 2 languages?
Happy.
You feel happy? Why do you feel happy?
Because I like to learn different languages.
That's very cool.
Nice. That's what he had to say. And after that video, they left. They moved out of the district in January. And I couldn't interview them in February. So I stayed in touch with his family. And in March, his mom sent me this video. He had been out of the classroom for about 2 months. And the clarity of the video is not very clear, but I put in embedded subtitles so you can read them. And this is a conversation between Adrian and his mom.
What did you say when I said buenos dias? What if Mrs. Stella says buenos dias?
That broke my heart. I don't like buenos dias, but I understand. It goes to show that students need meaningful context and a supportive language community to want to engage with another language. So I emailed his family this month and asked them to give me an update. One of the things his mom said is, I think he feels fine about learning Spanish. He still doesn't want us or me, the mom, speaking Spanish to him. The good news is he's enrolled in a dual language program. So when the new school year starts, hopefully he'll like buenos dias again. And this brings me to my policy recommendations. As a teacher, I recommend other teachers use TPR, especially in early childhood. And when there's a co-teaching situation, explore the use of translanguaging. I recommend recording some lessons to reflect on the unconscious supports we provide and how we might improve them. That's how I found out I was tailoring the use of gestures and picture support with my students. Finally, I recommend teachers always keep social and emotional well-being at the forefront of everything that you do. Academics, or Spanish in my case, will come at the right time, only if students feel emotionally and socially supported. As a school, I recommend providing professional development regarding TPR and translanguaging, also vertical alignment with TPR gestures. In my school, we are trying to use the same gestures with concepts that we do in all grades. So students already know the gestures like listen, speak, read, write, Venn diagram, cognates, the bridge of languages. So then students already know those signs. As a nation, I recommend crafting policies to elevate multilingualism. We should be past the point where dual language education is only seen as beneficial for English language learners. English dominant students can benefit equally from becoming truly biliterate throughout their educational experience. From my research, that means specifically focusing on ways we can better encourage native English speakers to become passionate about learning another language through implementing strategies like TPR and translanguaging. This could begin by providing more funding to study best practices and could extend to research on how to market the benefits of dual language, which I believe would help strengthen our pluralistic democracy. Thank you. And if there's any questions, now's the time.
Woo! Please feel free to unmute yourself. Give her a round of applause. That was a fantastic opening presentation, Estela. Thank you so much. As we are preparing for our first round of Q&A, I just want to remind you of two things. One is that there is a feedback form that Sarah has just put into the chat. Estela would love to hear from you in feedback form mode, so please fill that out for her. And the second is we'd love to hear your voice. So while you are welcome to chat questions to me or to, publicly, either one, you also can use in the bottom right, in the reactions spot where there's the emojis, there's also a raise hand option. And if you raise your hand, we definitely want to also hear you speak your question to Estela as it goes. So as you can see, Sue is giving you lots of congratulations. What questions do we have for Estela at this time? These can be clarification questions, contextual questions, next step questions.
Is there anything? Oh, hey, my name's Kristen. I'm from Teach Plus. Great job. It was lovely to hear. You're just such an engaging presenter too. Your kids must have had a great year. Is there anything from remote learning that you feel like would be beneficial to keep? Was there any kind of silver linings about teaching kids on the computer that hey, this could be maybe useful when we're all back in person, hopefully in the fall?
That's a great question. I haven't really thought about that, but now listening to your question, one thing that I didn't use before was presentations. As I was teaching the TPR, I would print out the picture or I would bring a real object. And some things, you might don't have the real object to show. And so I feel like this having the internet to find all the pictures, I think that's something that I started using, this year. So I'll definitely keep using some of that. The projector, I'm using, the projector, I'll use the projector much more. I also think that for family engagement, like this, being able to meet with all the families virtually and tailor the time better for parents. So I think that I'll continue to do that for family engagement. Thank you for your question.
Thank you.
Abigail, go ahead.
Hi, I really liked the images that you use for TPR and those kind of vocabulary slides that you were using with the little people with the gestures. Is there a curriculum that you use for all of those slides, or did you make all those yourself?
Thanks for your question. I did do those myself, the presentations, but I did use this website, ASL for little kids or something like that. So some of the gestures I used were from American Sign Language, and some of the signs I just made up, like if it made more sense for my kids, like fly. I couldn't find an ASL sign for fly, and we pretended that we found, we catched a fly and then it was flying. So this was our gesture for fly. So it was a mix, but yeah, I use ASL and the presentations I did myself. Thank you.
Very nice, thanks.
Jessica.
Great presentation. I was so excited to hear all of it. And I really want to hear a little bit about what was the process of the TPR virtually. I know the process in person, but I hadn't thought what does that look like day one, day two? I know we don't have a ton of time, but just a little bit of that, of how do you introduce the TPR, and then how do you support the children to start using it on their own?
Thank you for your question. It's great to see dual language pre-K colleagues here. So in the past, I've used TPR only at the end of our units. And this year, what was different is that I was using it consistently every week. And so I would pick one of the read alouds for the week, and I would just, from the past, I've learned that more than 4 or 5 words is too much. So sometimes it was just 3 or 4 words. And then I would, before the read aloud, I would just, we're going to read a book, and here are some words that are very important, and let's use our bodies for it. Let's listen to the words, let's say them, and then let's move and pretend. And so then I would just show them the picture. I would try to always have a real image, and then sometimes a clip art, like they usually see more in kids' books. So I think you saw some of the slides where it's both, and some just the real image and the movement. So, and then we would just practice, and then they were words that would come up in later on in other read aloud. So then I would just keep using them and just ask them to use them. And even now they are, doing also at the end of the year, even though that we learned that in the beginning. So yeah, that's how we did it. Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you again, Estella, and thank you so much for your questions. If you have further questions or you'd like to connect with Estella around some of her strategies, please make sure that you incorporate that into your feedback form for her. This is always a great opportunity to begin those kinds of collaborations. Let's give one last round of applause for Estella. Woo! And we are going to move it just up the age range. Stella focused on what she was able to learn in her teaching of students. Our next presenter is focusing on how to get students to learn from students. Think about that in a remote setting. So get excited. Our next presenter is Tarsia Ryan. Take it away, Tarsia.
Hello, everyone. Okay. Let me present my screen to you guys. All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Tarsia Ryan. I am a kindergarten teacher at South Shore Fine Arts Academy. The title of my presentation is Learning to Share, Sharing to Learn, Building a Foundation for Kindergartners. My school, South Shore Fine Arts Academy, it's located on the south side of Chicago near 71st and Stony. We are like a lottery school. You have to fill out an application to attend our school. So students don't necessarily live in the neighborhood. Students don't necessarily see their classmates outside of school either. So this year in kindergarten, I had 17 students, 9 girls, and 8 boys. One of the challenges with online learning was developing a classroom community, which is always a challenge in kindergarten, but it was especially difficult this year because we were learning online. Kindergarten, a little bit about kindergarten. Students in kindergarten are 5 and 6 years old, and they are often the youngest in their family. So they are used to being the center of attention. Developmentally, kindergartners are egocentric. In the developmental theory of Jean Piaget, he says that students in the pre-operational stage are unable to take on another person's perspective. So that means that usually they don't understand why other people do not think what they think. So if you know a 5 or 6 year old, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So in the beginning of the year, there were children in my class who wanted to share, but then there were other children who did not want to share. But there wasn't really anybody who wanted to take time and listen to another person share or make any comments on what they had to share. It was really all about, is it my turn yet? But that's typical of the pre-operational stage of learning. So out of the kids who I had who wanted to share something, they definitely was like, okay, yes, I want to share. Oh, okay, now who wants to provide feedback? Then that went to just like a few people. They were really concerned with, is it my turn yet? So my rationale, I wanted my students to develop active listening. I wanted them to be able to explain what a peer said and make a connection with each other and with each other's work. I believe that I am still learning all of the time and that I can learn from anyone. So quite naturally, I wanted my students to learn that same thing. I wanted them to begin to share knowledge with each other, even though I knew that they really didn't see themselves as a person who would give someone else knowledge because they were used to everyone telling them what to do, when to do it, how to do it. They are the listeners usually. So I wanted them to learn how to support each other, trust each other enough to share their work with each other. So my research questions, my main question was, how can I build a foundation for my kindergarten students to appreciate the value in sharing their work? My sub questions, what strategies can I use to help my kindergarten students learn to share, compare, and explain their work? What does it look like when kindergartners show value in sharing their work? And what happens when I give kindergarten students a chance to support each other by providing feedback on each other's work? I collected data by using questionnaires, student interviews, observations, and taking notes in my teacher journal. So for questionnaires, I sent parents the questionnaire and I instructed the parents to record exactly what their child said and not to alter any responses. I asked students questions myself. I interviewed them and asked them about how do you feel about sharing your work and do you like sharing your work, all of the time, we just talked about it. So I had student interviews, and throughout the research, I observed my students and took a lot of notes daily. And I reflected on these notes in my journal. So in my journal, I reflected on the notes that I took. I wrote down any ideas that I wanted to try with my students or any questions that I wanted to revisit. I used my journal for that. How did I spark their interest? Because as I already stated, they were mainly interested in themselves and is it my turn to share? So I did that through dramatization and role play. In the beginning, I noticed that my students would be eager to share, but when it was time for others to share, they would not pay any attention. Some of them would walk away from the screen. I would see them playing with a toy. I would see them talking to someone at home, take a bathroom break. I mean, they just did all kinds of things when it was time for someone else to share. So I decided in the beginning that maybe, I needed to really grab their attention, which is how I used dramatization. So for dramatization and role play, I like to call it, I presented them with a scenario and I asked them to act out how they would feel in this scenario. So for instance, it's your birthday, you just got a lot of balloons, they flew away. Show me what would happen if that was you in that situation. So then they would do it. Then I would ask another student to tell me what just happened. Tell me how your friend or your classmate said they would feel. What would they do if their balloons flew away? So the kids were able to, they actually listened and they paid attention. They acted it out and they interpreted. It was just like, oh, okay, so that's what you like, dramatization. All right, so I used that. I also use manipulatives for math number stories. I had them create a math number story, act it out. And then I asked a friend to retell that math number. They could do it. They could do it. So I was like, hey, that's another way. And I also used games. Now for games, this was after dramatization and manipulatives, and they were already learning, hey, there is a benefit in me listening to someone else, actually paying attention. So with the games, they realized that they'll do better on their turn if they listen to the person before them. They started to encourage each other. So these were the three main ways that I sparked their interest. So for dramatization, here are just some of the results that I got from dramatization. So on this particular time, on this day in November, 7 students were able to reenact a performance. 10 students were able to describe another person's dramatization. 5 students were able to do both. And some of the quotes that came straight from the mouth of the babes, she wouldn't like it. She did not smile. Happy, she was happy. Her cheeks went all the way up. His lips went up like this. He doesn't look very happy. his eyebrows did this. So these were their responses to another student's dramatization. When I used manipulatives, students were asked to use manipulative to create the math number story. Then their peers had to retell the story. So initially, 5 students were able to retell the story using manipulatives. They used the manipulative to retell the story that their friend told. 4 tried retelling without manipulatives and were not able to tell the story. Then I instructed them to try again using the manipulatives, and they were able to do it. So those numbers went up. Using the manipulatives, 9 of the students were actually able to reenact the math number story. Dramatization and manipulatives help students listen to peers more. Even when we were not dramatizing or using manipulatives, they had already learned that there was a benefit in listening to someone. So I began to make sure students shared writing every Monday. They shared writing during small groups, but not only did they share, but they had some time to also offer feedback to each other. What did you think about what they said? So sharing, providing feedback became a common practice in my classroom. So coming up next is a video that shows an example of a time when no one wanted to provide feedback. They were still thinking about, hey, it's my turn, right?
I went to the park. We went, I get a slushy.
You got a slushy. A slushy? Okay. Hold it up. Let us see.
I do mom and me. There's only me and her.
Okay, and what's under that picture of you and mom?
That's me. That's a slushy.
That's a slushy?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, thanks, Dejan. Let's see if your classmates have any feedback for you. All right, so if no one has any feedback, I have some feedback for you, Dejan. Thanks for writing more than one sentence. And thanks for drawing that picture, because when you drew the picture, it told us more about your story. In your story, you didn't tell us that mom was at the park with you, but in the picture, I saw mom, and that's how I know she was there with you. So sometimes drawing a picture helps us tell the story a little bit better.
So at that time, they were not interested in giving feedback. They were kind of listening, but nobody really wanted to provide feedback. So after I modeled how to provide feedback and prompted them to give more specific feedback, then the quality of feedback improved and more students were interested in giving feedback. So the next video is an example of this. They started out by saying, I would say, what did your friend, what did she say? I don't know. So that feedback went from I don't know to she said she went over her grandmother's house for the weekend. They were listening. It went from I like it to I like how you made the butterfly, or I like how you described what you did with your brothers and sisters. Feedback went from I don't know what they said, or I don't know. Well, can you ask her to say it again, to things like, when did this happen? Next time, I think you should draw a picture. How did you do that? What kind of pizza did you eat? What kind of game did you play? Oh, I went to Dave and Buster's before too. So they started making connections with each other. You will see that in this video.
You and me. I can't let you go. I like me. Go, go, go. love me alone. One is love, is me.
Now watch the feedback this
So,
time.
anybody have feedback for her for that poem that she wrote?
See their hands?
A lot of people got feedback about the poem. All right, let's start with you, Angela.
I like how you kept on saying the word love. I liked her poem.
What did you like about it?
I liked how she wrote it neatly. Yeah, I love when you write it good and nicely and gentle and slow. I like when you do that.
She said, thank you.
You're welcome.
Gentle and slow. How did you know she did it gentle and slow?
Because when you do it slow, it won't you mess up again.
Oh, okay. It helps you not to mess up. Oh.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, be it.
I went to the park.
Okay. Thank you. All right. All right. Do we have any feedback for her?
I wish you could draw a picture.
Tell the story. Right. Thanks, Rob. And thanks, Angela.
I will remember to draw a picture tomorrow.
Oh, tomorrow you will do that. Okay.
This next video is a group of students working together to create an unknown design with pattern blocks. So in the video, one student is giving the instructions and the other two students are moving the blocks accordingly. And this shows how they develop trust for each other and they did really begin to listen to each other more.
Layla heads the orange square at the bottom. All of them. Now put one square on top of another square. You see that? Other square. I want you to put another square on top of that square. Okay, it's going pretty good. Okay, let's put the blue piece on top of the hexagon. Right. So, the blue one on the side of the hexagon, like on this side. But how many? This. Okay. Layla. Orange piece at the bottom of the blue pieces. This is gonna be so much fun. also on top of the squares up here on the second side. I meant on the very top. On the very top? So do you want to move it this way? No, I wanted her to move it right.
Okay, she wanted you to move it right. Okay, now let me show Layla and
It
Brooklyn.
looks like the rat.
Bingo.
So back to my original question was, how can I build a foundation for my kindergarten students to appreciate the value in sharing their work? What strategies can I use to help my students share and compare and explain their work? So the strategies that I came up with: sharing and feedback, practicing sharing and feedback regularly, and making sure you model sharing, prompt students to provide detailed feedback. What does it look like when kindergartners show value in sharing their work? More students volunteer to share, students ask each other questions, and students expect feedback on their work. What happens when I give kindergarten students a chance to support each other by providing feedback on each other's work? They take pride in supporting each other, they learn from each other, and they develop better collaboration skills. So my recommendations are right here. So on a school level, I recommend modeling how to provide feedback, make time for sharing and providing feedback, and go beyond agree and disagree. Look for opportunities for students to support each other's learning. On a district level, prioritize community building and active listening, more PD on incorporating sharing and feedback loops in pre-K to 2, more PD on the benefits of dramatization and games in pre-K to 2. On a national level, let's adjust the Common Core standards to focus on active listening and community building in early childhood. Thank you very much for your attention.
Feel free to unmute yourself and give Tarsia some love. Woo! You were getting people pumped up while you were talking. There were already some props going into the chat and very specific things being noted by people already. You have a question from Natalie. Natalie, go ahead.
That was amazing. Thank you for sharing and doing all that work. I had a question because I know that a lot of times when kids are giving feedback, there's a large SEL component to it. And I'm wondering if you had to do any, or what SEL curriculum you used with it, or did you just kind of develop your own strategies and model that? Like what role social emotional played in that?
That's a great question. They played a huge role. Well, I did use Second Step, but of course, I had to add to it as we have to do everything else, because at the age of 5 or 6, they don't necessarily understand the importance of someone else's feelings. So they have no idea that if I walk away on your turn, that might hurt your feelings. Or you listen to me, that does not mean I have to listen to you, you know. So there was a lot of work around just showing someone else that you heard them or that you care about them, being a good friend, being a good member of the community, being a supportive member. There was a lot of work around that.
Thank you, Natalie. A reminder to please give Tarsia some feedback using the feedback form that Sarah has shared in the chat. It's a couple up now. We definitely appreciate your feedback. Abigail, go ahead.
Mine wasn't necessarily a question, but more of a comment. I really appreciated the reminder about how beneficial feedback is from other students to each other. And I see that as an engagement piece as well in your students, and that it became something that they actually really liked doing. And you could see a lot of kids began participating more. And so it ended up becoming a huge part of the engagement piece as well. So I just really appreciated that reminder, especially even in remote learning, that is still possible and still wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you, Abigail. Go ahead, Vicki.
Good evening, everybody. I am super proud of our teacher, Mrs. Tarcia Rhines. She's an amazing mentor teacher at our school. And I just wanted to ask a question about what type of learning. A lot of times we think about what students need to do and what kids need to do. What type of learning do we as adults need to do to further this in our classrooms? Because I think sometimes it gets missed that all of the onus is on what students need to do and have and know, and we forget our own learning as adults.
Okay, that is a great question. I'm so glad you asked. We need to do work around what's developmentally appropriate for early childhood. And so to start, what's not developmentally appropriate is spending the whole day trying to work every single subject into the day, and you can't leave this out. You know, this is your block, this is your block, these are your worksheets. That's not really the way early childhood students learn. So if we can get more PD around that, how to use dramatization and role play, how to get them talking and engaging with each other, what they can learn from, that would be just so beneficial, because we won't have them sitting in a seat all day and wonder why you have a lot of crying, or wonder why they can't focus at 3 and they just go straight to bed because that was too much for them. So I just think if we could just start with how important playtime is, how important the brain breaks are, how important the recess is, how important it is to make sure they're using manipulatives and they're able to be themselves and they're able to use their imagination. If we could all go back to school and learn that, or we can just put that all in the PD, man, we will really be going somewhere.
I love that. Thank you so very much. And I hope that that's something that we can expand beyond primary classrooms. I think that when we forget how much our older students also need to play and be able to use their imaginations and use manipulatives and dramatization. So thank you very much for that. I appreciate all of your research, and I have my own reflections on it as a leader. So I can't wait to put some of it in action. Thank you.
That was exactly why we have these policy forums, right? When we can bring teachers and we can bring other school leaders into the space, right? Our teachers are the first school leaders. So Tarcia, thank you so much for sharing your learning with us and your students learning with us. At this time, please give Tarcia one more round of applause. And then we are going to zoom forward to high school, and where we've now heard about learning from the teacher and learning from other students. In high school, you need to figure out how to learn from other sources. And our next presenter, Laura Cronky, is going to tell us about her journey teaching students about that. Take it away, Laura.
Hello. My students are not as little or cute as Tarcia's, but they're cute in their own ways. Let me, if I can get a, I'm good or not good. Good? Okay, thank you. So, okay. I'm Laura Cronky. I teach 10th and 12th grade social science at Solorio Academy High School in Gage Park. My project is titled, I Read It on the Onion, News Literacy in the Social Science Classroom. So to begin, I want you to think about how you access the news by considering these following questions. So you as adult humans, where do you get your news from? How do you know that what you're reading is credible and reliable? Do you trust everything that you read? Just think about these questions for the next few moments. These are the same questions that I asked my students to answer in the beginning of the school year, and the questions that sparked my interest in furthering this research project. As you can see on the slide, these are some student responses. They varied from acknowledging that source credibility and bias matter to literally nothing. Nothing really, if it looks sketchy, then I'm not trusting it. So this was one of the first insights I had to what students think when they look at news, read news, and maybe some of the buzzwords they knew about news literacy. And some people might think that these students were just trying to be funny. They were just writing anything. But this is far from the truth. These students were being genuine in their responses. And this was in November, so they didn't know me very well, but they were willing to just admit this is what it's like for a 15, 16-year-old in high school. After reading the initial survey data, it became my mission to engage students in the critical thinking required to be a conscious consumer of news. So as mentioned in the beginning, I'm a 10th and 12th grade social science teacher at Solorio Academy in Gage Park. Solorio is a neighborhood high school. The student population is just over 1,100. Demographically, Solorio is 95% Hispanic and 3% Black. The targeted class for this project was my 5th period honors United States history class. As many others I've watched present, there were some challenges with online learning, like from the beginning. And this class stood out to me in the beginning of the year. They were the most engaged in online learning. And I was like, you are gonna be the target class and you are gonna do awesome things. I thought I would get the most data from this specific class period. So in this class, there were 26 students total, 16 who identified as female and 10 who identified as male. And then my class for US history is taught chronologically. And we, in our US history team, have a strong connection to current events. So I planned to intertwine news literacy skills into the curriculum as opposed to an isolated unit. The thought process behind this was that if students were engaged in these skills throughout units with different topics, they would be able to take these skills and apply them in daily life. Prior to this school year and research project, I had minimal knowledge about what the outcomes would be if my students were engaged in news literacy. This led to my research question: what happens when I incorporate news literacy into my social science classroom? The following were the sub-questions I used to guide my research. So as Kate mentioned in the beginning, this was learning about strategies. So which activities impact students' ability to identify bias, credibility, and reliability? How can I foster confidence in students' ability to be critical consumers of information? And how did the implementation of news literacy strategies impact my teaching? By the end of my research, I found that I learned an extensive amount of information about teaching news literacy, which will be discussed later in my next steps section. So why news literacy, or maybe even what is news literacy? When considering a topic of interest for this project, I wanted to find a skill that had been a challenge for my students in the past. So in my classroom, students are regularly engaged in reading the news in a variety of ways. They're also engaged in historical thinking skills, source analysis, close reading. And in the past, every year, I put news sources in front of students that are fake news, and they read them at face value. And I was trying to dissect the why. Why is this happening? And this has happened, like I said, every school year without fail. I wanted to find more about strategies that would help students develop critical thinking skills when engaging with the news. This project was somewhat multifaceted as I was looking for best practices for teaching news literacy while engaging students in these skills. So taking on a new curriculum in a pandemic. So what is news literacy? When I was doing my literature review, I found that the discipline of news literacy is newer. So within the past 10 years or so, more research has been coming out about news literacy, and it's sometimes considered a subset of media literacy skills. The Stony Brook Center for News Literacy describes news literacy as critical thinking skills in order to judge the reliability and credibility of information, whether it comes via print, television, or the internet. This is the definition I use to guide my research and curriculum planning. So I was familiar with news literacy before this project, but I didn't know where to go, who was going to give me the answers I needed for news literacy curriculum. I consulted my literature review research to support my instructional choices. And if I were to recommend a path for pursuing the addition of news literacy into a classroom, these are some of the organizations that I found to be very useful. Standard Online Reasoning Curriculum, the News Literacy Project, and Stony Brook Center for News Literacy. Most of these organizations have lessons that you can just take and put into your class, but I wanted to make things more challenging and weave it within our historical and current event topics instead of isolating them as one-off lessons. And I'll go back and reflect on this later, how I would keep or change it next year. So stay tuned. So for my research project, there were 3 main sources of data: student surveys, student work, and my teacher journals. One challenge I faced during this project was the remote aspect of teaching. As many people have mentioned, I anticipated it would be more difficult to engage in some of the different types of data collection methods because I would not see students in person. As time progressed, I learned there would be a lot of Google icons, and by a lot, I mean they were all Google icons. Those replaced student faces and voices pretty quickly, and there wasn't as much verbal communication and engagement. So my first point of data collection was student surveys about considerations for engaging with the news. I wanted to know about how students understand their roles as news consumers, because this is something that they're interacting with daily, whether they can name it or not. And then I distributed a final survey at the end of second semester, so a few weeks ago, to learn more about the impact of the work with these skills throughout the year. The student work collection yielded the most results because I was able to analyze that data, and I did have about 50% of students complete these assignments in each class. That was collected on Google Classroom. And then I kept a weekly teacher journal that I updated after my lessons to reflect on and create next steps for curriculum choices. So were things working? What could I change, etc. So my student findings. In November, once I had solidified my area of research and potential sub-questions, I gave students a baseline survey to gather data on preliminary considerations for news consumption. The survey consisted of 6 questions, and 17 out of 26 students in my class responded to the survey. Not so much at the end of year survey, but we started off strong here. So the graphs you're looking at are 2 of the questions that I chose to analyze. The questions were open-ended. I used a lot of Google Forms so students could type their answers. It wasn't always like pick an answer, it was talk to me in the Google form box. So they could have more than one response represented in these graphs. The first question asked students where they get their news from. I categorized their responses into 4 different groups: television, print, social media, and websites. I was not surprised that many students turn to television and social media to access information, because I don't envision my students sitting at a dining room table or an armchair with the Chicago Tribune open. Maybe, but the data shows not so much. This data made me think about the implications or possibly even benefits of students accessing a large amount of their news from social media. It led me to consider how I could incorporate that skill into later lessons. The second question asked students about what they consider when choosing news sources. This was the same question that I asked you at the beginning of this presentation, and one that surprised me. I had 2 students say nothing. Again, nothing. They consider nothing. They just read. I had plans to use these 2 students as case studies, but unfortunately their attendance and participation in online school dropped. All was not lost though. Some data that I pulled from this survey that gave me hope was that students already knew buzzwords relating to news literacy. I was elated because I had no concrete evidence. It appeared that at some point in their education, They may have been introduced to concepts such as reliability and bias prior to my class. And I will, towards the end, revisit how this survey data somewhat misled me in planning future lessons based on assumptions. We don't do that. So as mentioned earlier in this presentation, I chose to incorporate news literacy strategies into my curriculum instead of as a separate unit. I will speak more on this teacher move in my reflections towards the end of this presentation. This is an activity, or this activity is an example of one of the lessons I incorporated into my curriculum during our Constitution unit in late November. I gave students minimal leading context to these two sources, and I asked them which one they would use to learn more about the constitutional sources, or the constitutional separation of powers between these two sources. So on one hand, one option was an NPR article, and the other was The Onion, which I think as adults, most of us are familiar with that and how that fits into credible news sources. This was also baseline data for me. 18 students completed this assignment, which was collected on Google Classroom. 15 of my students, or the majority of students, chose the NPR article, and 3 students chose the Onion article. My millennial brain was stumped that students chose the Onion as a credible news source. After this assignment and several instances of data analysis, I realized that students have different news context than I do. And that's one of my key takeaways at the end that you'll hear more about. While it was surprising to see that students chose the Onion, I later realized that students are maybe not familiar with the Onion in the same way that some adults are. I utilized this pick a source activity in several different contexts throughout the year and yielded similar results. Okay. Another type of news literacy skill I had students practice was titled, "Is this source legit?" And it was adapted from the News Literacy Project. I began this skill focus with a mini lesson where I taught the 3 types of news sources: user-generated content, unfamiliar source or organization, and standard-based news sources. The News Literacy Project provides questions for assessing each type of source. For example, if it's an unfamiliar source or organization, can you conduct a web search and locate information about this source? So each of these had different questions that students could ask once they had categorized it. I then conducted a formative assessment by having students practice categorizing different types of sources, which you can see on the bottom in the graph. I predicted students would be able to easily identify user-generated and standard-based news sources because those are the ones that I knew or thought students were most likely to engage with. As seen in this mini lesson formative chart, students struggled with the Illinois Policy Group and the Washington Examiner. This data reminded me of my theme throughout this research project: start with the basics. I blame some of that on pandemic brain, but this is a recurring theme throughout the presentation and one that I'll take with me next year. I realized students might not be familiar with these organizations, and by examining different types of news sources throughout the year, students could expand their knowledge of different news sources. The summative assessment was a tweet. Oh, okay. 78% of students correctly classified, and responses for why the tweet was legit varied between questioning the author, questioning content, and comparing sources. Students were able to apply their news literacy skills to analyze the author and the content in the tweet. This was a useful skill with a catchy title, but it was somewhat challenging for students due to their lack of broad knowledge of news sources, which again can be fixed in the future. The final news literacy strategy I implemented was lateral reading, which was a strategy that I learned about from my literature review. I pulled most of my resources for this from the Stanford Civic Online Reasoning Center. By definition, lateral reading, I'm having a tech issue. Okay. By definition, lateral reading is searching for information about a source while you're reading it. So you're checking for currency, relevancy, authority, accuracy, and purpose by reading what other sites say about a source. So I tell my students during this activity If you have 20 tabs open on your browser, you're doing lateral reading correctly, or most likely. So when I introduced this strategy to my students, we were in our unit on industrialization and practice with the current events article related to Amazon and working conditions. I modeled how to use lateral reading for the first 3 questions and gathered data on student independent work for the last 2. There were mixed results with students' ability to identify connections to other credible sources and locate any contradictions of information to that of what they read. We practiced this skill many times throughout the month of April with various articles, and I gave them a summative assessment in May to assess their ability to use lateral reading to judge source credibility. For the lateral reading summative assessment, I gave students a Southside Weekly article about the environmental impacts of COVID-19. I had 11 students complete the assessment. All 11 students stated that the source was credible and attributed the credibility of the source to a variety of reasons. They used those 5 questions from the last slide to write their conclusions about source credibility. The majority of students demonstrated lateral reading skills by attributing source credibility to locating the same information about the topic across different online sources. Because this response was open-ended, student responses sometimes contain more than one reason. A few students attributed credibility to the origin of the newspaper, which isn't technically lateral reading, but it still demonstrates they were considering origin of the source. In the future, I would like to examine if there's a correlation between news that directly relates to students. So this is Southside Weekly about the environmental impacts of COVID-19 on the South Side and their ability to demonstrate news literacy skills. In my quest for understanding how students viewed the work we did with news literacy this year, I aimed to have a plethora of data from an end-of-year survey. Unfortunately, due to a likely combination of pandemic fatigue mixed with online school fatigue, we're hanging in there. I did not receive enough surveys back to gather valuable data with which to draw conclusions. So I only had 5 students out of 26 submit the survey, and I gave them several weeks. If you're a teacher, you know that's where a lot of us are at, but I didn't think there was enough information that I could pull from there. I'm hopeful that the various activities I collected data from this year, alongside my personal reflections, will help me plan for next year's news literacy instruction. In connection with my 3rd sub-question about how the implementation of news literacy impacted my teaching, I have several takeaways as listed on this slide. First, I found that I need to ground myself in remembering to start with the basics. There were many times throughout the year where my data was impacted by the lack of providing basic context. For example, having students define key vocabulary related to news literacy or identifying news sources they use. Another area is to dig deeper into students' metacognition. What are they thinking about when they're utilizing news strategies? I hope when they leave my classroom, students still use these strategies when interacting with the news. I also found the strategy I was most looking forward to implementing, lateral reading, appeared to capture many news literacy skills successfully. The research supports the usefulness of the strategy to teach students the skills that professional fact checkers use. I'm looking forward to learning more about the strategy over the summer and starting earlier with it next year. So my conclusions. As a result of my research, I was able to draw 3 main conclusions about news literacy in my classroom. First, like I said, the inclusion of news literacy into a broader curriculum requires starting with the basics. I assume my students had context about news literacy, news sources, and buzzwords related to news literacy. Upon further investigation, this was not the case. Second, as with many other academic skills, repetition is key. I often felt crunched for time in the school year, which led to me speeding up the curriculum instead of slowing it down. If we spent more time on fewer types of activities, I believe the learning would have been more concrete. And lastly, I learned from my research that it is possible for students to become fact checkers. I watch students use critical thinking in similar ways as adults who are professionally trained in this field. Providing young people with opportunities to practice new skills in meaningful ways can lead to successful outcomes. I typically center my class around students becoming historians. We can now add professional fact checkers to their high school resumes. And I can't see the chat. Am I out of time? Where's the?
You have a couple minutes if you need to take it. That's
okay.
fine.
I have like 1 left. Thank you. So next steps. During this year, I gained valuable knowledge about what it means to engage in news literacy. I have spent a lot of time reflecting on how the lessons went, how I can improve my curriculum for next year. I plan to communicate my findings with my U.S. history partners and consider ways to structure these lessons in the future. Hopefully, in-person school in the fall will make it a smoother transition to starting the work earlier. Planning to backwards map different skills involved in news literacy and adapt it to our current curriculum. I plan to have students use the tools they have at their fingertips, such as phones, tablets, or laptops, to investigate the news they interact with daily. There's no better time than now to engage students in news literacy. In terms of policy recommendations, I would encourage school districts to consider adding news literacy into their curriculums. It is imperative that students have the opportunity to learn these skills while they're young. Most of my project was guided by my own outside research. I would encourage schools and districts to provide teachers with professional development around news literacy. This is not a skill isolated to only the social sciences. All teachers can teach news literacy and critical thinking skills. It would be ideal that news literacy becomes an interdisciplinary subject. Furthermore, at the school level, schools can host workshops for parents and guardians on news literacy to educate and inform people in the school community about the importance of identifying and stopping the spread of fake news. I can think of many times where fake news relating to immigration patrol in my school's neighborhood was spread around and created panic. Some panic is avoidable through education. In the past few years, we've been bombarded with a variety of news sources, including fake news, propaganda, and hoaxes, some which have been manipulated by the government and media. The sooner we start to build these critical thinking students nationally, the better. Thank you for your time. I look forward to answering any questions you may have about my project and hope that you will think twice before sharing random articles on social media.
Laura, I think that your presentation may be the most relevant of any possible teacher presentation to all of us as adults right now who've been doom scrolling for the last year plus and could really use some of the fact checking that your young people were developing. We have a feedback form in the chat. Please give Laura feedback, and then I'm going to kick it right off to Kristen for your first question.
Hey, Laura, sorry, I'm off camera. I've got kids on me, but I was a former high school teacher too, and I love just like the relevance of your project, as Kate just said. I think as adults, we all see like how important this is, and I think you kind of pitched that at the end. I'm wondering, like, did you have to build the case for kids, like why they should care about this? Like, was that a hard sell to kids, or was it a pretty easy natural sell to them, or did you have to put some time and effort into like not getting them to care, but like getting them engaged and like why this is important?
I think that's a really great question, and one that I haven't considered. I do think the barrier of being online made it more difficult to gauge like students' buy-in. I also think sometimes we know students are motivated by like, this is an assignment, do this assignment and you'll get credit. Some were like totally bought in, and unfortunately the events of the past year, I think, made students realize like this is happening around me. I mean, we were in class in January when like the insurrection took place, and students were like sharing articles in our chat, but some of them were not, like, with the speed with which information flies around without people considering it. I think the buy-in there with the students, because some of them expressed that they wanted to make sure what they're sharing was factual.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
We have another question from the audience that feels particularly relevant in the current context of like public outcry around teaching critical race theory and all of the debate around that. And this question is, how do you think teachers can address possible accusations of indoctrination if they're teaching news literacy? Critical race theory or otherwise.
Right.
How can teachers address that?
And I was thinking that too as I was like putting this presentation together, and I was like, hoaxes, media, conspiracy theories, even with like vaccination and COVID, just everything. A lot of things in America feel heavy right now. But I think the most important thing is that this isn't just a skill for like liberals or people that buy into like the government, like as Democrats. I think there are ways to pull in articles from all sides. I found this website, All Sides, and you can look up a topic like immigration, and it will show you different articles from like the left, center, and right. So you can examine it in that way. But that's in the back of my mind always as a social science teacher. I think teaching in CPS, at least at my school, it's kind of teach what you want. But I do think we need to be intentional about that. I do think though it's more about the critical thinking skills that are transferable to everyday life than like indoctrinating the children.
Thank you. And that is a super challenging question that bears all of us thinking about more, right? So appreciate that a lot. Did you see that someone in the audience has a connection to that site? That's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, and one final question for you this evening, Laura. We've got this from KJ. Everyone can also see this in the chat, but what does your gut tell you about why some students chose the Onion as their source? Can you say a little bit more about context?
Yes, so the topic for that was separation of powers in the government, and the context, like students had both links to the articles. I wrote this in my paper and I didn't touch a lot about it in my presentation, but I noticed that students get sucked in by titles. So like the clickbait, and I think students sometimes will, this is a prediction, but students will pick like a title that's shorter. The Onion article was definitely shorter than the NPR article. And I think when students sometimes are in a rush to do an assignment, like they couldn't articulate why they chose that one. And then later they had to tell me like who the author was and they couldn't figure that out either. And those are small points where I'm like, if I were in the physical classroom, I think a lot of these conclusions would have been easier for me to draw. And also like that metacognition, what are they thinking about while they're doing these activities?
Thank you, Laura, and thank you for tackling such an important and like critical and challenging topic at this time. We've got some people giving you applause in the audience. Let's give Laura some last love.
Thank you.
And now we have to move to something that's near and dear to my heart. And we're going to move back down the age to our only like real elementary teacher. But we just spent a lot of time thinking about news, clickbait, fake news, etc. And during the pandemic, this feels very relevant. Well, computer literacy, also very relevant in this day and age. And I am going to pass it on to Angelica Tobias to tell us about how she incorporated STEM with her students during this time.
Thank you. Sorry, I've got to make sure I can share my screen. And give me just a moment. All right, you guys can see it, and I can't see my notes. So just a moment, but you can't see my notes, right?
Correct.
Okay. All right. Here we go. All right. Good evening. Thank you so much for being here and taking the time to hear all about our action research. My name is Angelica Tobias, and I am the engineering lead teacher at Marvin Cameras Children's Engineering School, where I've been a teacher since it opened in 2010. The topic of my presentation is Advancing STEM Equity for Hispanic Girls, the 21st Century Game of Chutes and Ladders. So before I get started, I wanted to ask if any of you have played the classic up and down children's game of Chutes and Ladders when you were little. That's the game where players start at square one and use the spinner to advance that number of squares sequentially through the squares. The first player to reach square 100 wins. However, it's not that simple or sequential because if you happen to land on the bottom of the ladder square, you can move your player to the top of the ladder and advance quickly, skipping several squares. Conversely, if you land on the top of a chute square, then your player slides down the chute and moves back several squares. So I reference this up and down game because it resembles not only the progress we have made as a children's engineering school since opening, but also resembles the progress this past year in my action research project and the progress for Hispanic females in regards to STEM equity. So throughout this presentation, I will reference chutes or ladders moments. So Cameras is located in the Belmont Cragen neighborhood. And it's a pre-K through 8th grade neighborhood school with about 860 students. Over 89% of our students are Hispanic and 80% of our students are low income. As I stated, I'm the engineering lead teacher, and I have led and coordinated our school's science and engineering program for the past 10 years. So here's a ladder moment. We recently became a CPS STEM school under the CPS STEM department in 2019. STEM stands for Science, Technology, Engineering, and Math, and it has been promoted for several years because of the shortage and the future labor demand for certain STEM professionals, such as engineers and computer scientists. I have coached our 5th through 8th grade Lego Robotics after school club for over 6 years plus. And over those years, I have noticed consistently the disproportionate larger number of boys in the program compared to the girls, even though I would really make a purposeful effort to invite girls. When I was in the classroom teaching engineering, I also noticed how boys seem to be more engaged than girls in STEM, especially in coding. So last year, I committed to bring an after-school STEM program that was targeted to girls. I decided on Girls Who Code, a coding program designed for girls. So as an engineering teacher, I always knew that there was a gender and diversity gap. And as I looked into computer science statistics, I found that though females represent about 57% of the workforce, females only make up about 26% of the computing jobs. But if you dive deeper, Hispanic females make up 2% of all computer science jobs. So these statistics made it really super easy for me to decide what my action research was going to be. So my main research question became, what happens when Hispanic girls engage in a gender-based coding program? And as an educator, it was important for me to know what instructional strategies and activities would be most effective for encouraging Hispanic girls' interest and participation in coding. And then, would participating in a STEM program affect their sense of self-efficacy towards STEM? And then lastly, would exposure to a STEM program change the girls' interest and perceptions of STEM as a possible career? So here are my participants for this action research. There were 12 girls that signed up for the 3rd through 5th grade Girls Who Code Club. The majority of the girls that joined were in 5th grade. So I want to give you first an overview of the Girls Who Code program. Girls Who Code is a national nonprofit organization committed to closing the gender gap in computer science. Our weekly 1-hour meetings were Fridays after school and consisted of different activities that were designed to engage and encourage the girls to introduce them to coding in a safe environment. The software that was used for coding was Scratch. It was created by MIT as an educational tool for coding. Users can use the block-based program by creating projects like video games, animations, and simulations. So you just kind of grab a block and drag it down, and then you create a sequence of blocks and then you run it. There are tutorials, and the girls learned how to code objects called sprites and use blocks to make different projects. I have embedded the girls' programs as a gift throughout the rest of this presentation to showcase their work. So you'll find them in the lower left of some of my presentation slides. So here's my data collection methods. I started at the beginning of the program with a STEM survey to gather their interest and feelings towards STEM and STEM careers. The survey was given at the beginning and then again at the end of the program. They were asked to complete an exit ticket at the end of most meetings. The exit ticket was all open response, and the questions asked them how they felt about their coding, what they struggled with, or what they were proud of, what their favorite activities were, and how they felt in general about each session. I took attendance at every meeting since this was an after-school program and not a required class, and I had hoped attendance would provide me with some data. I had a teacher journal where I wrote weekly on what was going on in my club or in my regular school day. And finally, I conducted exit interviews at the end of the program to capture their thoughts. So please notice Ariana's Animator name project in the lower left. Here's the attendance data. Our Girls Who Code started mid-November and met weekly through the end of March for a total of 15 times. Though we only had 12 girls who were interested, we only had a total of 8 girls show up at any one time. However, as you can see right there, there was a big drop of attendance at the beginning of February. This was definitely a Schutz moment. This was also a transition to Q4. That was also the start of our school's out of school time, the OST, after school program. We unexpectedly received funds to start after school programs, so about 3 of my girls stopped coming to join the other after school clubs. However, this still doesn't account for the other girls that stopped attending, but I'll address that later on. There were 3 girls that stayed through the end, and even though they sometimes missed a week here or there, they were the last 3 girls that stayed. They were the last man standing. So here's Emily's Animate Your Name project. This is a summary of their favorite activities. This was an open response question, and I coded it to these categories. Here you can see the different categories. For example, the sisterhood activities were social emotional learning activities to build community, and we did that at the start of every meeting. However, the data shows that the coding was by far their most favorite activity. Over 61% of responses said that coding was their favorite activity. This is definitely a ladder moment, and it's significant because that shows that the girls liked coding, and most of these girls had never coded before. So I wanted to incorporate these research-based practices in the instruction. For those of you who don't know, pair programming is a collaborative method where 2 people are partnered to write code. They also use it in the program in computer science, the actual industry as well. Another practice was implementing culturally responsive instruction, which is teaching in a way that values and affirms their culture, who they are, and experiences, so students are receptive to learning. Here are some examples which I tried, but I had a hard time implementing some of them. I was not able to implement pair programming due to the nature of remote learning. I tried to do breakout rooms instead, but this was also sometimes difficult due to slow internet speeds, which make it difficult for girls to share their screens or for their screens to load quickly, especially if you have something complex as programming. It takes a while for the screen to load. Encouragement from both parents and teachers have been found to help build girls' interest in coding. So when the girls completed a project like Animate Your Name project, I created badges for them and sent it to their parents and CC'd them in the email celebrating their accomplishment. So here's an example of 2 badges that I made for them that I sent it to them. However, this practice was very short-lived because I didn't get many girls finishing projects or being able to post their projects in our group Scratch Studio, again, due to internet or technical problems. Another reason was I also became overwhelmed with my after-school with my added school responsibilities, not my after-school responsibilities, my in-school responsibilities. Being the STEM teacher, and along with my regular engineering lead teacher responsibilities, which I'll talk about later in my Schutz moment. So this is the data summary of all their responses on how they felt about their coding skills after each meeting. So what was striking to me was that the most often response given was the word proud. Oops, I'm sorry, I messed up. Okay, no, I didn't. Okay, it's even more significant because this was an open response question, which shows that the girls were able to identify that feeling to their coding. So it was open response. So they didn't select it. That's what they responded. So you can also see the majority of the responses were positive as well. So it wasn't just proud. There was I loved it, I liked it, so excited, happy. Those were all positive responses. So here's the same responses, but not coded. I just pulled them from the exit ticket, so you can see that these are also positive feelings about their coding. And it's not just a certain thing, an item. It was proud because they helped their friends. It was proud because they never used Scratch and they were pretty good. They proud because they accomplished something. So just different reasons why they were proud. So here's Ariana's Pong game that keeps score down at the bottom. So why are feelings about their coding skills important? Self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is a belief in one's ability to perform a specific task, and has been found that it's been found that this is positively related to interest and engagement. Here's Alexa's Make It Pop game, where she added a score to the game as well. So looking at the data of how the girls felt about their coding and the responses that coding was their favorite activity, there's a big disconnect between their response data and the drop in attendance data. So girls just stopped coming to the club. So why? To try to answer that question at the end of the club, I conducted exit interviews where I asked girls why they stopped coming to the club and other questions. So here's the data from the exit interviews. Here you can see Emily's clicker game where she also added a score. The first question I asked in the exit interview was if they liked that the club was only for girls. So looking at the data, you can tell with certainty that it was a resounding yes. The only girl who didn't answer yes answered kinda. That was her response to me. When I questioned further, she commented that she wanted more people to join, whether they were boys or girls. And this is one of the 3 girls who kept attending through the end. So why did so many girls stop attending the meetings? According to the data, it was for a variety of reasons. So here's the data. Some girls got bored, some girls were tired after a long week, they just want to watch TV. Some girls had family obligations like babysitting or going to do laundry or errands with their family. Some girls joined a different club or activity. One of the girls emailed me and said she couldn't make it anymore because that was the day her mom would go to do laundry to get a head start on the week. The one I wanted to look closer though were the 2 hard responses, which accounted for the 22%. Some girls remarked that it was confusing or they had a hard time logging into the Scratch account. Others weren't able to share their projects, so that way we could see them in our studio. Others said the coding was too hard. So I wanted to dive a little deeper into the responses that said it was too hard. Here's Alexa's project at the bottom. One question I asked was what were some things girls would change about the club? Here's the data of the open responses, again, open responses that I coded. But the number one answer to change the club was to make it easier. So this ties in with the response of why they stopped coming. It was just too hard. I had to reflect on this, and there were some aspects that were hard. Trying to code virtually when you've never coded was hard. Creating a Scratch account was hard because without a parent's email approval, you can't get in, or you can't share your project. You couldn't share your project into our studio. Trying to finish our projects when the internet was slow was hard. Trying to have girls work together was hard, even in breakout rooms, and providing support as they worked on their project was hard, even with a tutorial. These were all virtual learning obstacles that made it hard because of the pandemic. So let's dive deeper with this case study for the coding being too hard with Girl T. Girl T is a 5th grader, and she joined later and came for the first and only time to our 6th meeting and had a hard time coding even after following the tutorial. I had the girls go to the breakout rooms and I stayed and tried to help her. I feel coming late to the party as per se contributed to her difficulty. She had coded before, but had been using an easier website that was more of a paint by number style, which provided more scaffolding. She wrote, if you notice, she wrote that she was furious and angry in her exit ticket response and quit the club and never came back. You can see her responses on the right from the exit ticket and her exit interview. So I also reached out to her at the end and to get information. And I wanted to highlight her suggestion right there that she wrote of make it easier. So we need to rethink the idea that easier is good or better. We need to work on scaffolding and building resilience and perseverance in our students. So when they struggle, they don't quit. But with our help, they can use their problem-solving engineering habits of mind. So this leads me to my struggles or shoot moments this year. As a release teacher, this is not assigned to classes. So I'm not assigned to classes, so I'm a resource or an extra body when we are short teachers, which is often, and I have been pulled from my work to sub and teach classes. Our other release teachers and administration also have done their fair share in subbing too, so I know it's just the nature of our education system right now. The worst moment this year was suddenly losing our STEM teacher. He was loved by us, and it was another punch to the gut. Sorry, I didn't think I was going to get this emotional here, but it was another punch to the gut for our Cameras family during this pandemic. He was one of the STEM leaders at our school, and we started together the first year Cameras opened up. So I stepped in with lesson plans, and we started together the first year. I stepped in with lesson plans and eventually teaching STEM and grading in Q3 while still doing my job. This was overwhelming. and there were a lot of late nights. Because of this, I missed a lot of opportunities in the coding club to reflect and refine my practice. So I feel this was a big part of the drop in attendance as well. So here is Sophia's, let me take a drink. Here's Sophia's Animate Your Name project. So what are my latter moments? Despite the pandemic and all the struggles, we persevered and made STEM progress. I was able to coordinate our school-wide virtual STEM events, such as our Spooky STEM Week, Hour of Code Week, and Engineers Week. We hired a first-year STEM teacher who has fit right in despite their first-year teaching, and they've been able to adapt to CPS's hybrid instruction. And we have still been able to continue to advance STEM instruction to all our students. And finally, one big ladder moment was seeing that the types of exposure to STEM does make a difference to our students. And in this case, it made a difference in my action research project. We just need to work towards advancing STEM equity one square at a time and be reflective. So we skip over those shoot moments and more on the ladder moments. So for example, here's one of a big ladder moment. Please listen to Emily, one of our Girls Who Code members, who stayed until the very end. I asked her what she had gotten from this club. And I love how I asked her what she had gotten from this club. So let me play that. If I can reach that little button here, give me one moment. Gotta move that over. Here we go. Oops.
What I've gotten from this club is like learning that like you can make codes even though you're a girl or a boy, and that anything girls can do, boys probably can do too, and that it's really fun to scratch and try new stuff.
Okay. Did you ever, were you ever interested in STEM before?
I'm not sure. I don't think I've ever heard of coding before.
So I just love how she encourages the boys. Anything girls can do, boys probably can do too. So I thought that was great. So that's pretty powerful. So here are my recommendations. As a school, we need to continue with Girls Who Code and make sure we are adapting it with culturally relevant instruction. We need to have that repeated early exposure to STEM. And then also important to be reflective and purposeful in our instruction. I was overwhelmed, so I wasn't as reflective and purposeful as I could have been. So that's why I feel that was a really big drop with those, drop the ball. We also need to recruit more STEM allies within our teachers and parents to encourage our Hispanic girls. So for the district, we can pilot a Girls Who Code GWC Girls Who Code test study to see what works best for our diverse students using the culturally responsive instruction. Also having support groups for Girls Who Code instructors will help teachers reach out to others to reflect and collaborate, because I was the only one in my building doing that. At the national level, continue with Girls Who Code opportunities and push to adopt computer science standards in the States. So coding gets taught at all our schools, not just the better schools. And finally, I believe most teachers would agree with this. And I know it's not part of my action research, but in this pandemic has highlighted the importance of providing accessible, reliable internet networks for all our students. And so I want to thank you so much for taking the time to learn about my action research project. And thank you to all that I've listed here that helped me, especially Kate and Deb, who really pushed me, because I wouldn't be here without you guys. Thank you.
Everybody, let's give Angelica some love.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing with such honesty and openness, a journey that felt like it had lots of ups and downs. I think that we also have to step back and celebrate the fact that you took on such a challenging activity at a time when many teachers are like, I'm not doing an after school program. This is not the time to try that. And so the fact that you were able to provide that to students during this year was invaluable. So thank you so much.
Thanks.
At this time, what questions do you have for Angelica? As you are thinking, please note that a feedback form is available in the chat.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
I have a question as a STEM teacher and STEM specialist at my school. And that is, as you head into a year where, fingers crossed, you'll be able to be working in person with students after school, are you interested in continuing a coding club? And what lessons are you going to take for any club that you do?
So yes, I'm definitely, I've done the Lego robotics before, but this one was really, I guess, more personal because of being a Hispanic female myself. So I'm definitely going to continue with that. And then some of the lessons, definitely, I really want to try that pair programming. I really think that that is going to be very important for our kids. But I also want to do a regular coding club as well, because some of the boys were like, hey, how come we can't join? So, but yes, definitely for all, coding for all is very important. But it was really interesting to see that gap for Hispanic females. It's just amazing. So thank you.
Thank you. It's inspiring to me.
I have a question. Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, Deb.
Okay.
Please go.
Angelica, how important do you think after this year outreach to the community and families is? Do you think that can make a difference in terms of getting more girls involved?
Actually, that is really good, because that's one of the big things that I had actually just talked to my principal about. Is like, we need to make those connections. I want to get, in fact, I asked her if I could provide a survey for parents. I would hopefully send it out next week. I want to see the backgrounds, the experiences, what jobs they have, STEM professional jobs that they might have, and bring it back to our school versus just getting someone from Motorola, or which are wonderful things. But I mean, how cool if I see you know, Sydney's mom, who's a doctor, and she comes to our school, or you know, Angelica's dad, who's an engineer, who comes to our school. I think that's very powerful. So
I agree. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Deb. We have some love from Katie Hollerbach about the idea of STEM allies, and she's wondering how she, as a social science teacher, could help her students, especially those who are interested in STEM, see the connections between her content and yours.
That's another great question, Katie. So that's the other thing that we are doing too. I'm actually, we have a STEM committee at our school, and this year we started work on STEM integration into content areas. So there are different things that people go about. You know, it can be as simple as technology, but the deeper technology, not like I'm going to go into a website, but like Laura, that critical thinking is also part of that STEM connection. And then creating maybe an infographic about what you found. Making those connections is also a STEM integrations, but it's that you know, in the Bloom's technology, it's that higher order thinking. So I didn't just read it, I analyzed it, I synthesized it, I put it in an infographic, and now I'm going to create something else. So that's the things that we're lacking right now, but I do want to make that connection eventually, step by step. So.
Thank you, Angelica. Thank you for sharing your story. And also thank you for all that you are doing to advance equity in STEM for our students in CPS and beyond. So let's give Angelica one more round of applause.
Thank you. And everybody else here too. Awesome job. Very, very, very proud to know all of you guys here. Thanks.
This has been a wonderful community. And keep in mind, for folks who haven't been with us this entire time, no one here has had a chance to formally meet each other in person. This has all been over Zoom. So the community that has been built around this deeply shared interest in teaching practice and reflection on that practice. And I think if I needed to give a word for tonight's 5 presentations, the word I probably would use is democracy. Our teachers are all thinking about how can they advance democracy in our society, and democratizing education in different ways. And no one's work exemplifies that like our final presenters. She's going to take us back down to our youngest young people and show us how you can work to do this equity work with some of the youngest members of our democracy. So Sydney Allen, take us away.
Thank you so much for that amazing intro. Hello and good evening, everyone. My name is Sydney Allen. I'm a first grade teacher at Pulaski International School of Chicago. I will be presenting Little Kids, Big Conversations, how first graders learn about race, gender, and discrimination. Before we begin, I want you all to imagine this. You have a new colleague at work. You're having trouble connecting with them. Take a look at this list and consider if any of these could be a factor. Being Black is constantly on the forefront of my mind. However, it wasn't until my 7th year of teaching when it became such a prevalent worry for me when I became a first grade teacher at Pulaski International School of Chicago. Pulaski is in Bucktown, Chicago. Due to gentrification, the Latinx population dropped from 83% in 2015 to 65.5% in 2020. While the white population more than doubled from 12% to 26.6%. I had never worked among a predominantly white staff nor classroom, and the primary grades had substantially fewer children of color than the middle grades as the demographics changed with the gentrifying neighborhood. I quickly learned that kids are kids, and I have fallen in love with each and every one of my classes, as I had in the years prior. However, I often thought, even before working at Pulaski, to be mindful to keep discussions of race and gender limited because I worried about angering parents with differing views. But as one of the 3 Black teachers in the staff of 77 teachers and support staff, I worried even more about putting a negative spotlight on my classroom. In the fall of 2020, a particular moment challenged my fears. It was not the first, nor would it be the last, but it stayed with me the entire school year. This is Cortland. He was in my class last year. He was a funny, energetic, caring first grader. During the Pledge of Allegiance, Cortland would jokingly kneel. I asked Cortland one day if he knew what kneeling during the Pledge of Allegiance meant. He said no, and this was my response. If you don't know what an action means, we should not do it unless we fully understand it. Although wise words, I cringed when I said it. It was a statement that continued to bother me throughout the school year because I wanted to be able to share why the action was so important to me and other Black people in the United States. This, along with ending the school year presenting to first grade parents alongside my first grade team on the importance of having conversations with their children about race and racism, on the heels of the murders of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd, I knew the school year of 2020-2021 would be unlike any other, and I could no longer hide behind my fears. So I embarked on answering the following question. How do first graders respond when explicit lessons about race, gender, racism, and other forms of discrimination are embedded into the first grade reading, writing, and social studies curriculum? My sub-questions were, what strategies can be used to teach about race, gender, and discrimination in a developmentally appropriate way that fosters high participation from all students? And how do first graders show an ability to ally for marginalized groups or a sense of pride if they are a part of a marginalized group? My class demographics this year were as follows: 10 males and 11 females, 9 Latinx students, 9 students who were white or white passing, 2 students who were white and Asian biracial, and 1 Black student. This data was collected in a 100% virtual environment. The curricular strategies I used were picture books, open-ended questions, ebooks to teach about nonfiction topics, videos from PBS Kids, Khan Academy for Kids, and Brain Pop Jr., and purposefully choosing images or places to stop in a book or video that told a story so students could make observations. I made sure before I dove into any discriminations that marginalized groups have faced historically or are facing in the present day to spend time reading books that show joy within those communities. I read books with a plethora of different types of characters that were gender fluid, Black, Asian, and Latinx. Reflecting back, I realized I didn't have any books that featured students with disabilities. The data I'm going to show is from 3 recorded sessions, another session in which participation was captured just in the chat of our Google Meets meeting, and how some students responded to what they were being taught. So these are my findings. From October to December, I relied mainly on field notes to collect data. I felt this didn't tell the whole story, therefore I started recording my lessons in January. At this point, we had already talked about ancestry, melanin, race, racism, and Indigenous people. During the lessons in January, we spent 3 days learning about the civil rights movement, activism, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. My students learned about the civil rights movement. When my students learned about the civil rights movement, they responded overwhelmingly with a sense of unfairness and sadness. Lexi said in regards to the civil rights protest, "They're fighting for what's right. They don't think it's fair, and I don't think it's fair either." Sammy said in regards to the multiple arrests of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., "I think it was unfair that Martin Luther King Jr. got arrested. Martin Luther King got arrested because it's unfair." I recorded the lessons over 3 days, but I chose the second day, which had the highest amount of participation overall, to analyze for this presentation. 63% of my students overall participated in the discussion and stayed on topic and provided insightful and empathetic responses. However, 86% of white passing students participated. When I dug a little deeper, I realized that a majority of the conversation was dominated by the white females in my class, whose comments made up 49% of the total comments. My initial thoughts were it may be easier for white students to discuss racial discrimination against Black people because it does not directly affect their racial group. However, I did feel concerned that there was little engagement from my students of color, particularly my Black student, Jason, who had just transferred from a predominantly Black school and had started the school year with high participation and a desire to connect with his peers. Being in a virtual format, I tried to create break times in which students could engage with each other. And although Jason constantly sought out people to talk to during the break, it was rare that other students engaged. I wondered if other students' lack of engagement with him, on top of being in a virtual setting and being the only Black student, led to his declining participation in whole class discussions. In February, we talked more about Asian cultures while learning about the Lunar New Year. We read a book entitled The Name Jar by Yang Suk Chow. White and white passing students dominated the conversation. And my white females, again, spoke the most out of any other intersected group. Their comments made up 30% of the total comments. Jason had not contributed to these recorded conversations yet. I did notice there was a trend, this was a trend not only in discussion about race and gender in regards to high participation by white females, but it was across the board in all subject areas. Some interventions I put in place in January and February were teaching students how to use the chat effectively. After our morning meetings, placing the kids in heterogeneous, randomly selected groups to talk about a would you rather statement in a breakout room, and giving think time and explicitly talking about the reasons why I gave that time. Because I realized that in this new modality of teaching, I was so concerned with keeping the momentum moving, I wasn't giving enough processing time before calling on students to answer questions. In March, I saw an increase in participation of students of color when we discussed the terms gender, Latina, Latino, and Latinx. In this conversation, my male students of color contributed to a majority of the oral dialogue. Also, Jason participated this day as well. It could mean that allowing for think time provided space for other students to share their thoughts. Also, there was a different variation of students who participated, and this could mean that giving time to answer would you rather questions at the beginning of the day allowed more students to feel comfortable sharing. My Latinx students make up 41% of the classroom population, so they may feel more comfortable participating in higher numbers when there are more students who look like them in the classroom and when the curriculum is reflective of their racial identity. From the first 3 data sets, it appeared white students, when they are at a higher percentage in a diverse class, are more likely to participate regardless of whether the curriculum is reflective of their racial identity. In March, I captured the responses from the chat due to technical issues with recording when we discussed gender bias in sports after celebrating the accomplishments of Megan Rapinoe and her wife, Sue Bird. Students again expressed concern, anger, and sadness about fairness when asked the following question: women in professional sports are generally paid less than men. What do you think about this? Empathy from this data was expressed through crying or angry face emojis and single word answers such as bad, sad, or mad. Henry wrote, "It is not fair." Sachi showed dismay through her emojis, and Emily showed anger through hers. The data in the chat showed a majority of students who responded were again white students. More students of color participated in the chat, however. London, a white female student, participated the most and had the highest amount of relevant comments. This could be because London was not only very comfortable expressing herself orally, but also because she had adapted well to learning virtually and could use the chat with ease. I also want to note that only one of the biracial Asian students, Sachi, was present. Her name is Sachi. She generally is pretty quiet during class discussions. However, I noticed that she participated significantly by providing 19% of the comments in the chat. The chat may be the best tool for participation for students who are shy like Sachi. Again, Jason did not participate in the chat. In the chat, 91% of my female students participated in comparison to 38% of my male students. The higher number of participation by female students could be because my students who identify as girls felt more connected to this learning because it was relevant to their gender identity. The final data set showed again white and white passing students speaking a majority of the time when we discussed anti-Asian sentiments in April. I want to reiterate that this finding was not exclusive to conversations about race and gender. This was happening across multiple content areas. However, when I analyzed the responses in the chat, a majority of the responses were from my Latinx students and from Jason. So, to answer my main question, students respond with empathy and a concern for unfairness. They are able to stay on topic. Most conversations resulted in over 60% of the students participating. To answer my second sub-question, the strategies I found to be the most effective were highly engaging picture books, videos, and ebooks, asking open-ended questions, providing low-stakes time during the day to chat in diverse groups, and giving think time. The following data answers the final sub-question: how do first graders show an ability to ally for marginalized groups or a sense of pride if they are a part of a marginalized group? A couple students started responding right away to the instruction. This is London. In October, London was very saddened when she learned about the word racism. Our conversation sparked London to check out books during her weekly trips to the library with her mom that featured people of color. She shared this book with me in November, which is clearly too difficult for her. Also in November, when she learned some history about Indigenous people of the United States, she was very interested in their lives and their culture, but she was shocked and saddened when she realized they had been killed and displaced by white settlers. She responded to the writing prompt of how will you celebrate the lives of Indigenous people during your Thanksgiving celebration like this? And this is just audio.
I know this is a lot, but to celebrate Indigenous people, I will eat turkey and decorate and celebrate for their death and give thanks. I did that right.
Finally, her mom sent a note early in the school year. The final paragraph really explains the importance of having these conversations with your children. Since being in your class, London is developing a vocabulary around race, and I am eternally grateful. The other night, she initiated a conversation about darker skin, and in her tone, I heard that she thought it was a beautiful difference, and why would someone not want dark skin? Theo, as well, became quite the advocate. When we learned about the 3 branches of government, he expressed a desire to be able to create laws like Black Lives Matter. In response to parent surveys given in November and April, Theo's parents stated that he wanted to take Hebrew classes after learning the word culture. Also, Theo had been talking about the relationship between ancestral locations and melanin. He had become fascinated with Indigenous culture, and he hung a Black Lives Matter sign in the house. Emma was the first child to self-identify as Latina after learning the term. When learning about the 3 branches of government, she expressed interest in becoming the first Mexican-American president. In response to a parent survey in April, Emma's parents said she started asking more questions about her culture and about racism and injustices. She also loved sharing her pride for her culture with the class. She shared this video with our class in April.
Is my uniform for my 10th class. I do ballet for my culture. The steps, and I like the steps. We do like this all together. And I like doing the
David showed a lot of pride and joy when learning about the historical figure Dolores Huerta. Dolores Huerta came up with the phrase "si se puede." David used it in the chat when we were studying migrant farmers' workers' rights. He wanted to meet her, so I reached out to her, but we never heard back. Here's how he responded when asked, "Who is a woman you admire to celebrate women in history in March?"
So Dolores is a Poland woman to me because she fought for workers' rights.
Who showed a lot of pride for their Asian identity. After reading the name jar, Sachi, who is Japanese and white, shared that her name means happiness and shared this with me. "I have Asian race," in response to my morning message on Seesaw, our learning app, when I stated we would be learning more about Asian culture that day. Also, during the read aloud, Emmett, who is Korean and white, connected with the story by telling the class, "My mom likes kimchi," like what the character in the story was eating. "My mom's last name is Kim," like the grocery store owner. "My Korean name is Sunjun." Also, Emmett's mom expressed gratitude for exposure to the Asian American experience at a young age. Emma, David, Sachi, and Emmett show that when students are provided lessons in which they can connect culturally, they are able to identify and show pride for other parts of their culture or identity that may otherwise have gone unnoticed in our classroom. I am left with some outstanding questions. Are we teaching our white students to make space for diverse voices? And how could this impact white adults interacting with adults who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color? How can we teach our students to make space for diverse voices without them being the spokesperson? How can we encourage our students who are the minority to participate without singling them out? So these are my recommendations. For educators, having history lessons with a variety of perspectives should start in the primary grades so students can begin to make connections and show pride for where they come from. And so young children can begin to build empathy for and knowledge of historical events that impact the present day. We should have libraries filled with diverse types of people, racially, ethnically, with a variety of gender variances, LGBTQ+ characters, people with disabilities, and neurodiversity. We should provide plenty of time for students to engage in diverse groups with fun, low-stakes activities. We as educators should be doing ongoing personal explorations through journaling, reading, and therapy sessions to process our identities, how our identities affect us, and be actively working on how to heal from this, and educate ourselves on history and the perspectives of others that we are ignorant to. From there, we need to have hard conversations with each other and understand how our implicit biases affect our interactions with our students and other adults. For school and district-wide, embedded into our professional development should be anti-bias training and culturally responsive teaching and training. Also, investing in a social-emotional curriculum like the NORA project, the curriculum used at my school, in which students learn how to identify and manage their emotions, learn how to empathize with others, learn about diversity and different forms of discrimination as well. And finally, there should be national standards that focus on teaching the untold perspectives of marginalized people in the US to build children's empathy and historical knowledge from a young age. Thank you.
I was feeling chills during like the entire last 7 minutes or so of your presentation. So thank you. Thank you so much, Sydney. We will very shortly, right now, have a feedback form for Sydney. And I know that her email only popped up briefly. So if you want to connect further and learn, and learn more, please indicate that interest in your feedback form so that you can continue these conversations. These are incredibly important conversations for us to be having as educators and the broader educational community. And we have a question from Katie. Katie wonders, how can we create similar supports like this for students next year once we're back in person? For example, Google Meet chat will be less immediately relevant.
Yeah. So what I'm thinking possibly of doing is like creating little keychains in which students have access to at least 3, if not 4 or 5 different types of emotions. So that way, if they aren't able to speak aloud or aren't able to write their response, they're at least able to show their emotions, as so many kids use the chat for.
That is incredibly cool. That is so cool. What other questions do you have? We want to make sure that people do have processing time because this is a topic that a lot of us have not spent enough time thinking about in schools.
I'm thinking, as you can, do you think the way that you chose to approach this year, which was wonderful, works particularly well when there's a mixed group of kids of different racial backgrounds? Or how might you handle that if you were would you handle it? Would you approach it the same way if you were in a classroom of mostly students of color, for example?
You know, that's a great question. And I don't think I have an answer to it immediately. I think that's something I really have to consider, the racial background of my students, the socioeconomic background of the students, how I go about approaching it. So yeah, that's definitely what I'm going to think about, Deb. Sorry, again, I don't have an answer for that off the top of my head.
Yeah, no, I think it's because it's probably easy to assume, and probably right to assume, that often white students really need this kind of conversation, but you often end up having very few students of color in a lot of classrooms, and you're concerned about how to handle that and be respectful of those students of color. is really important. And that's what I'm kind of thinking about in my head. It's just a comment more than a question, I guess.
And I think the level of participation might have been different if there were fewer white students in the classroom, because they make up 41% of my class.
Right.
I mean, even when we talked about, like when we spent a few days just talking about the terms Latino, Latina, and Latinx, and then read some books, I mean, the participation just shot up just because I have 41% Latinx students in my class, and they were able to connect, and they were excited about what they were learning. And they're responding because the books that we read had Spanish in it, and a lot of them speak Spanish or have family members that do. So yeah, I think it really depends on, I would definitely choose different books probably. And there'd be a lot of factors that I'd be considering as I choose images or books prior to beginning that instruction with a different cohort of kids.
Yep, thank you.
I have a question. Sydney, I'd just love to know how Jason ended the year. Did he settle down and expand, or is he just a quiet kid? What do you think?
He is actually shining right now. So because we're at the end of the school year, there's a lot more time where I have him in breakout rooms doing activities. And every time I pop into his particular breakout room, there is always chatter. He's like showing his dog off. He's showing how to share the screen. He's showing off his work. And I'm seeing the direct impact of that in our whole class lessons. So he is participating more in whole class lessons now that I am providing more time to chat with each other in just low stakes time. And that's something that like I really reflected on with a colleague after this is all said and done. Just having that time to just talk to each other and connect with each other, I think really helps students become closer and just be able to feel more comfortable sharing things that they wouldn't share otherwise.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
That feels like something that we have to remember as adults doing the work as well, right? It's so easy to just say we need to get down to business and we need to get to the work, but having opportunities to see each other as humans, whether it's putting ourselves in breakout rooms just to chat, feels so useful. Well, Sydney, you have tons of comments in the chat. I want to give you an opportunity to read them. I will not say anything about them out loud. I will say to the entire group though, what Sarah just shared, that there is going to be a study group more exploring this. So please consider applying to be a member of that group. And at this time, I'm going to turn things over back to Deb after we give Sydney a final round of applause.
Thank you all.
Deb, you're muted.
Thank you. This is one of the challenges of this year is not knowing how to technology very well, but the challenges that we all are aware of in terms of the pandemic and the remote learning and the openings and closings and all of that kind of thing. But I think that what all of these presentations have really highlighted are the challenges that our teachers face in the classroom and take on with great courage and initiative. And last week we had teachers who talked, there was a thread between those, I would say that they were about trying to encourage students to take ownership of their learning in various kinds of ways. And tonight I feel like we learned a lot about other kinds of challenges that our 5 teachers have faced, anywhere from trying to teach language remotely to trying to build community with little ones remotely, to trying to convince teenagers that not everything on social media is true, to try to foster an after-school program at a school that clearly was struggling with trying to take care of the things that they had to do during the regular school day, and all hands were on deck, and to talk about difficult subjects that Sydney just spent time talking about, that grown-ups are challenged by talking about, let alone little ones, or maybe the little ones are going to lead the way for us. So I am so impressed Lastly, I'm just going to say this is a bunch of people that really did support each other beautifully through a year that was full of all of these kind of personal and professional challenges. And that's really the way I think that we made it through. I'm awed and impressed by you guys and how much you were there for each other and how much you were fan clubs for each other. And thank you for that. It was you helped me get into this year and made it easier for me. So I learned a lot from all of you. So thank you. I'm very proud of you. And I think Sarah's going to say goodnight to all of us, and I wish you a wonderful summer.
So Deb, I'll make it short because that was perfect and beautiful. We are so incredibly proud of all 9 of our fellows. This was such an impressive, inspired group. I can't get over how incredible all of these presentations were. All of your research was robust and rich and interesting and meaningful. So thank you for sharing it with us. And thank you to Deb and thank you to Kate. Kate, you are so good at this moderation. I couldn't have picked a better person. So thank you so much for doing that for us. And that's it. And thank you all for joining us. We have a lot going on at CFE, so check us out. And if you can, we have a lot of virtual study groups going on this summer and fall. So check those out too. Sydney's one of them, Kate's one of them. So at any rate, have a wonderful evening. Thanks again for joining us and hope to talk to you all soon. Bye.